Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Lewitzo. Welcome to week 4 online here for our ALEC 341 podcasting class. Here's a little bit of what you need to get done this week. Read textbook chapters 4 and 5. You remember our textbook. Hopefully you have it at this point for class. Watch this lecture video, which you're doing right now. Fantastic. And submit your podcast profile paper by midnight Tuesday. And I apologize already. I believe this is supposed to be February 7th. Yes. No, Tuesday, February 6th. I do have it correct on this slide. Getting confused. So podcast profile paper due Tuesday, February 6th. And your online activity number 3 also due that same day. Okay, so chapter 4, to review that from the reading, I hope you're keeping up with that. It talks about turning your ideas into audio. So we've talked a lot about the discovery phase of creating our podcasts. Now we're moving into the actual how do we turn it into a podcast part. So this recommends that you be authentic in the work that you do for your podcast. When you conduct your interview, when you put your concepts together that you're wanting to talk about. Be authentically engaged, authentically care about your topic and your scientist. And, we know big data is this really sort of complex thing, but you should really be sincere in wanting to find out more about it. So always have an authenticity to your podcast. Your podcast should also have a beginning, middle, and end, right? So it should not just be you hit record and all of a sudden it's 2 people talking and you aren't quite sure where you're starting with this and what it's about or where it's kicking off, and then all of a sudden it just cuts off and it's over. We'll actually have an intro at the beginning to set it up. You'll need to tell who you are. You'll need to tell what streaming science is. You'll need to tell sort of your conceptualization of big data, and then talk about the person that you are speaking to in the podcast. The middle should be the interview. I'd also like to hear some thoughts and narrative woven in and some natural sound woven into that interview. You might interview the person in 2 places. Have them show you around the lab and talk about it a little bit, or show you some things on their computer and the spreadsheets they've been working with, and then also have the sit-down interview with them. And you'll want to weave some of that together in the middle. I encourage you to go back and listen to last year's podcasts from student Katie Bagneski. Hers actually did a really nice job of weaving narrative into the interview. She would break it up and discuss what she was thinking at different points in the interview and then play pieces of the interview. You might think about a format like that. And then the ending would be wrapping it all up, telling people, what you learned from interacting with your scientist and how this has changed your own thinking of big data, or calling them to action to do something with big data in their lives or have a different understanding of it. Then also sending them to the website to listen to more podcasts and to keep following along with us. So we'll really need to talk about this in our upcoming class here this week 4 on Wednesday. We need to sort of develop an agreed upon structure and framework for this series of podcasts and how we hope they work. Chapter 4 also talks about getting to know your guests ahead of time. Don't just go in cold turkey and hope that it all turns out okay magically and you don't have any rapport with the person. You need to sort of meet with them ahead of time. And get to know them a little bit, learn about their work casually and informally before you start rolling on the podcast. So you'll also need to start working on your interview questions. That'll be due here in a couple weeks. You can type out and come up with real questions, and that's probably a good place to start if you haven't done a lot of interviewing. And then those can shift into bullet points that you send to your scientist to say, here are the main things that we're going to be talking about in this interview. This chapter also talks about, should you share your questions ahead of time with your scientist, right? So it has sort of a presentation of both sides of that. The journalism side says no, because you don't want to feed them information ahead of time and let them prep or memorize their answers. You want it to be genuine, authentic. But then the other side, sort of the public relations side of what we do with streaming science, says yes, let them know what you're going to ask them ahead of time so they can kind of get their head around it. Now, I would say as a rule of thumb, never send your exact word for word questions to someone. Because I've even had people type out their answer and then want to read it to me by the time I get to their office. You don't want them to be able to do that exactly, but do give them bullet points. We're going to talk about your research, particularly this one study you've been doing. We're going to talk about your definition of what big data is. We're going to talk about what were you like as a scientist? What do you hope people learn from your research? Give them sort of those bullet points, but not your exact questions. The chapter also talks about the importance of being able to segue between topics, between questions. You will have to be an active listener and engaged in what they're saying when they answer your question, and you'll need to be able to pick up a part of their answer to use it and sort of summarize it and then move into your next question. You can also use natural sound as a segue between questions. You can also use the narrative where you reflect and talk a little bit about what you're learning before you weave back into the interview. But you need to make sure you don't just go, when they give their answer, go, cool, and then answer and then ask your next question. You need to make sure it all flows and transitions from topic to topic, question to question. That being said, you also need to be spontaneous in what you do. So, you have this format, you have this bullet points of things you're going to talk about, but they might give you a really intriguing or interesting answer, and you might have a follow-up question that's not on your list that you think is worth digging into and asking more about. Or they might say something that is funny. You should be willing to laugh. Or they might have a really serious story, and you might be willing to share your thoughts on, oh, that's really terrible. How did that impact you in your life, sort of thing. So be willing to also roll with the flow. Be a curious podcast host. Be yourself and be curious. You need to ask the questions the listeners are thinking, but they don't get the opportunity to ask, so you need to do it for them. You need to be really, truly engaged and excited about the topic. Big data is maybe not always the most exciting, and it could be very complex, but you need to honestly be curious about it. What might this study show us? How much data are we talking about here? What led you to choose focusing on this particular topic and spend your life working on it? You need to ask really sincere, true, curious questions. And then don't be afraid, like we said, to add some narrative into the interview in places that you can go back and write up and record later after the interview, and then edit into your timeline to sort of cut that up a little bit if we need to. Chapter 5 now starts to move into how do you bring the world into your podcast. A lot of podcasts might happen in a studio, at home, or at a radio station, but there needs to be a flexibility to be able to take your podcasts out to locations where you record the natural sound of things happening. In the chapter, he talks about he was in a coffee shop conducting an interview, and all the espresso machines and things got really loud, and he decided to keep that sound into the interview because it set the tone for how the interview was really going and what it was like. Other tips are listen before you record. So when you visit your scientist ahead of time, what kinds of noises do you hear in their office or in their lab? Record some of that stuff before or after your interview with them, so you might be able to use it to weave in and out of your sound bites. If you notice, sometimes my computer here, as you know, makes this just constant humming noise of it's getting sort of loud and it's underneath my voice. When you edit, you could edit that hum out. So one way to do that is to just roll on recording just that sound. Everyone gets quiet and you just record that hum. And then when you pick up that hum, you'll be able to edit out of the sound bites and interview that happens. And I'll show you how to do some of that work later if we need to. You can use identifiable sound as a transition or a seg between segments, a car driving by, or in a PCR machine being used in a lab, or the refrigerator when they get their tissue samples in and out that they're about to work on, or the whir of the different equipment they have might be able to be something you can use as a segue into what they're talking about. If they're talking about big data outside that have to do with wind turbines or things like that, record that sound. Be creative. Go to those places, get that sound and weave it in. So podcasting isn't just one thing. The chapter says it can be whatever you want it to be, whatever you imagine. Very cool. So now I want to take you back a little bit to get to know some of the history of broadcasting. Did you know broadcasting is actually an agricultural term? It was broadcasting the seed, spreading the seed in the field. So just like that, audio, radio, you're spreading the information, you're broadcasting it out to people. A lot of broadcasting happens in a booth, in a radio station. We're going to go to KRVN on Innovation Campus next week and meet with Bryce Duskett and learn about his work there, and you'll see a studio. A studio environment usually has 2 booths. At a radio station, they'll have one booth where they're doing sort of the running the programming, recording commercials, all the things you do that are sort of the commercial side. Then sometimes you'll have the journalism piece where the reporters are doing their work and announcers and things like that. Or the 2 booths might be everything related to the control grid in one room and then the actual sound and the person speaking in the other room. But they're usually set up a couple different ways. They're used for production work. There's a lot of acoustics things you'll notice when you go into a studio. It's really quiet air, quiet sound. They have all those sound deadening panels on the ceilings and walls, and they really suck things in. Also be aware, when I started first back in the day, when I started working in radio, we used reel-to-reel to record and play things. So literally the big tapes here that you had to have on the spindles. I honestly never had to do editing with them, thank goodness. I just had to do recording. Then we have the cart system. So this rack of carts over here on the right side of the screen, those are sort of like 8-track meat cassette player things that those were with the tape inside that you recorded the audio on in one machine and then played it to the other machine. And it was this system of when you were on the air speaking, you also had to be putting in your carts at the right time. Now everything lives on our computer, plays out of software. We have MP3 files, much easier these days. Here's what the audio chain looks like a lot of times for field work, also studio work. You have voice, you have music, you have sound. It feeds through all these channels to a mixer. A mixer then feeds to a hard drive or a reel-to-reel recorder and feeds to monitors. So no, it's a very complex thing. If you're ever going to work in radio, they use a lot of hand signals. Stand by, start recording, turn on your mic. Turn off your mic, speed up, slow down, turn up your audio, turn it down, and station break. So those are just fun things to know about if you're ever going to be a public relations person and you need to go in and speak in a studio live on the air, or if you yourself are ever going to be a broadcaster. You probably won't use these when you sit down and record your podcast with your scientist, but I do bet you'll want to do push record and then count down for your person. And then so like 3, 2, 1, go, and you'll start talking and then it'll go. So you gave yourself a pause at the beginning of the audio to edit before you cut it all up. You should also know a little bit about sound waves from this class. Sound waves have an amplitude, which is the height of the wave. They have a wavelength, which is the length between the trough between waves. And they have frequency. So this black bar here, how frequent the sound jumps up and down. And you will see sound waves in Audition or Audacity when you cut them up. And you will notice, where there are breaks that you're going to be cutting things. You'll notice that when you increase the volume, it does something to the amplitude and the wavelength. All things to be aware of when it comes to audio. When you are recording audio in the field, you need to sort of use the selective attention principle. Here at Raising Nebraska, this broadcaster was interviewing Beth Janning, the extension educator that ran the exhibit. Lots going on in that room, cooking demonstrations, people all around. The radio person could have been really sort of overwhelmed by it all when you train yourself to think in sound, but they had to focus in on Beth. They had to focus in with that microphone so that the viewer would have sort of selective attention in that environment. Some other tips: survey your location ahead of time. Because of all that sound, you need to be aware of just being in the space where you're going to record and what sounds are there. You might have to ask if there's a loud computer humming away or music playing or a refrigerator plugged in that's making a lot of noise in that space. You might have to ask to turn some of that stuff off or turn it down or find a way to get somewhere more quiet. Use a lavalier with a windscreen on each of you. The windscreen literally cuts down on wind sound. It helps a lot. Never record without a windscreen if possible. Always make sure your iPad has enough memory available to be able to record a long, lengthy podcast. You don't want to get to the point where you've recorded 10, 15 minutes and all of a sudden it stops recording because the memory is full of too many photos on that iPad or something like that. We try to keep them cleaned up here in the office. Jenny does a great job of getting stuff on them, but you might always just double check before you get recording and do a test recording first. Just play around with like a fun question with your scientist and record it to make sure it sounds okay and play it back to yourself, plug it back in and get going. All right, your podcast profile paper instructions, it is due on the 6th. I believe I have the date wrong here. This is the one where I had it wrong. Due on the 6th, 30 points, approximately 2 to 3 pages, double space, 12-point font. Put your name at the top of it, please, so I know it's yours. I want you to identify a podcast that discusses scientific issues for the public. Listen to at least 3 to 4 episodes of it. And then here's the outline. In the introduction, tell me what it is, describe the episodes, provide a link to it. In the body, talk about all these things we've talked about our own podcasts. Who are the target audiences, do you think, for that podcast? What would be an ideal listener? That listener avatar we've talked about. What type of hosting techniques were used? Was it an interview or was it just topic and discussion? What do you think is the mission statement for that podcast? So I don't want you to just make assumptions about all of this. You're also going to have to dig through their website and provide quotes and examples that tell you some of this information. But then also you might have to make some assumptions or connect the dots to figure out some of this stuff. So tell me what the topics of the podcasts were. What you liked, what you didn't like in the conclusion of this thing. If you learned something you didn't know before, how could what you learned and experienced with this podcast possibly apply to your own approach for producing your podcast for this class and all that good stuff. So I look forward to reading about all the different podcasts you guys check out. That's always kind of fun for me to learn about new ones that might be out there. So read chapters 4 and 5 and don't forget your podcast profile paper, online activity 3, all due by February 6th. Hope you guys have a great week 4.